Well, hi everybody. How you doing today? This is Charlene O'Hanlon. I am the managing editor at DevOps.com, and I'm moderating today's cool new webinar that we have with CA called DevOps at 10. What got us here won't get us there. It's going to be a discussion between Dan Zentgraf, who's Senior Principal Marketing Manager at CA, and myself, and hopefully it'll be a spirited discussion. But before we get started with that, I do have a few housekeeping items I need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded. So if you miss any or all of today's discussion, you'll be receiving a link to the event post-event so that you can access the webinar on demand. And we are going to be taking audience questions. So if you have a question for either Dan or I today, just use your control panel and submit your question, and we will hopefully get to all the questions before the end of the webinar. Okay, so Dan, thanks for joining me today. It's great to see you, quite literally.
Shirley, yeah, right? Yay, technology.
Exactly. I'm actually
Yay, getting good webinar going.
right. So let's talk about DevOps at 10. I can't believe that DevOps is actually older than my youngest child, and that's kind of a scary thought. But it actually seems to me that DevOps is older than 10, but I don't know. Maybe it's at 10 the name DevOps was officially born and not actually the processes itself.
Well, yeah, we have a bunch of jokes about that around here. The local, you go to the DevOps community. There's a bunch of us who've been doing it for a while, and we've got a variety of jokes about how we've finally given a buzzword to stuff we were doing back in the day, right? And at least the mindset that we had about how we did stuff, kind of how we had that natural affinity, and why we got into DevOps early ourselves. But yeah, it's been kind of a wild ride, really. I mean, you go back and you look at it and you think, wow, 10 years, that's like a tenth of a century. But in a lot of ways, it seems like we've been talking about this a lot longer. And I'd speculate. I mean, I got into it. I was involved with the Agile movement relatively early on, and I came to DevOps through that path, right? As I was in a situation where Agile mattered, and in my organization, and then I found out, you ran into some of the classic problems of DevOps, and lo and behold, someone gave it a name, and once you have a name for something, it
once
has
you
power.
name it, you've got to keep it, right?
That's right.
It's like
right.
having a pet. If
The
you name
puppy.
it, you keep it. Right?
Right.
So
The dog follows you home once you.
Yeah. So what are some of the kind of the biggest high level changes that you've seen that have happened in the DevOps space in the last 10 years?
Oh, wow.
It's a tough one, but when you think back on DevOps, 10 years ago and you compare it today, what comes to mind? What is kind of like that, if there was maybe an aha moment that you had, or just something that really kind of screams DevOps over the past 10 years that you can remember?
It's funny. My first response to this question was, people actually want to talk about it now. They don't give you a blank look. and the other thing is, to at least a certain point, you've got people who can actually discuss it and have made progress in adopting it in their organizations in an organized way. And I think that's probably the biggest transition has been awareness. And I mean, I know that sounds kind of weak and non-specific, but what DevOps has really managed to do is to bring a conversation about transforming how we deliver software, transforming our IT processes into the enterprise and into business, into common practice. And they're always the poster childs and sort of the high visibility stuff around the unicorns, the people who were the pioneers of this stuff. But when it goes mainstream, and I would make the argument that we've crossed the chasm and we're in the early mainstream now. The fact that organizations actually are willing to have an engaged conversation about transforming something pretty fundamental to how they do their business and how it impacts their business, that's a pretty major shift for sort of a broad idea about how do we remove the barrier to get ops moving as fast as dev.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That was the
Mm-hmm.
original thesis, right?
Right.
Ops is dev has gone agile. It's moving too fast relative to dev and or relative to ops, and ops can't get the stuff that dev's producing out fast enough. We should unify that so it's one thing,
Mm-hmm.
and you know we'll have new capabilities and new speed, and I don't think people realized how it would enable new business models and really allow business itself to change, and that's really been I think the biggest, most meaningful change. May not be the most visible one in a lot of cases, but it's definitely the one that's been most impactful.
Okay. Well, do you think part of that is because maybe before companies saw DevOps as something that just other organizations did or other organizations could do, but but their business was too big, too bulky, too legacy, too whatever to not be successful in DevOps? Do you think that awareness has kind of come around to the companies of all sizes that yes, DevOps can work in your organization if it's implemented correctly?
Yeah, I mean, once people start, as with any new business movement, right? Once people start making money with it, or
Mhm.
actually seeing business success
Right.
with it, lo and behold, it's suddenly a good idea to bring into our business. And I think that's really been, that with any of these new technological shifts or whatnot. I think early on there was a lot of folks who thought it was either too touchy feely, or it was something just for startups. Um, it was too ill defined, or it was just something that the techies did. Right? I mean, that was something the developers do. I don't understand what the developers do, but they make the apps, and I like the apps, so as long as they're happy making the apps, I'm happy. And
Yeah.
it was sort of that. Yeah, and we're going to talk as we talk about culture, right? But there's this a lot of, especially in the early days, this notion that IT is this service thing that the business sort of throws money at, and we kind of get what we get out of it. And Agile and DevOps and a lot of the practices and mindsets and re-engineering that they bring to the table, they move that needle in a lot of organizations. And the more that happens, I think the more you'll see enterprises figuring that out and figuring out ways to leverage it, and adopt it, and really understand that there's real hardcore business value that this can deliver if you get it right.
Right. If you get it right, and that's the important part. Yeah. If it can just be a money pit if enterprises just only do DevOps part way, or they don't see success and they immediately, and so they abandon it, or for whatever metric they actually don't put together metrics that they can live by, and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think getting it right obviously is you know is the most important thing in DevOps. But but what do you think, in your opinion, has the industry gotten right about DevOps?
Um, the thing the industry's gotten right about DevOps took a while to get right,
Hmm.
because there's been a lot of tools that have been thrown at it, a lot of sort of blind alleys. Where it gets it right is when we talk about the fact that it's a journey, and we start talking about continuous improvement, and we start talking about those core disciplines, that you sort of are where you are, right? You've got to pick a direction and go, but you're going to have to realize that it's a journey. It's not a project.
Hmm.
It's not an implementation. And to a large extent, this is one of the challenges businesses had with it too, is that so much of IT funding is project based. And to adopt a lot of these practices, you have to transform to looking at these as more of a product that you're delivering into the marketplace, right? And whatever that means, your app is a product, whether it's internal or external. if you fund it like a product and something that you are delivering, through which you are delivering value, how do you then incrementally improve that to continue to deliver more and more value through that application? How do you retire features that aren't delivering value? Those kinds of things that in a product sense you're used to doing, but if you're in an IT sense, you're used to implementing it, you've got it funded as a project, and it has a start, it has a middle, it has an end, and then it collects dust for a year until somebody can get funding for the next lunge through it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really tough paradigm to break, right? Sometimes we lump that under culture, but
Right.
it's a fundamental paradigm on which the culture is built, and that I think uh, has been a real challenge to transform. Where we've seen success with that, and where the industry's really gotten things right, kind of
Mm-hmm.
coming back full circle. I got into the wrong too soon. But I'm a firm believer to an extent, though, that you have to define a problem to really solve it.
Right.
But where the industry gets things right is it actually helps frame that conversation. It by virtue of engaging in the marketplace, working with customers, working with enterprises, finds finds these challenges, finds ways to organize the conversation, define the problem, package it up, and turn it into something actionable for enterprises, something that enterprises can actually consume. That's why you see so many of these little infinity sign DevOps. What's DevOps mean? And they give a little Mobius strip
Right.
infinity loop thing going. And it's become a common paradigm for putting the conversation out there and organizing and having a discussion about DevOps. And that just simple free market dynamic where that's bubbled up as a common framework for a discussion is hugely powerful in helping companies get started on their journey, moving
Mm-hmm.
forward with their journey, prioritizing what to work on next in their journey, and just that market dynamic of, if vendors want to participate in the DevOps space, how do we organize the conversation? It's something our customers can consume. That market dynamic has been massively helpful in moving this forward in terms of visibility, building that understanding, bubbling the successes that we saw early on with DevOps into an enterprise context that enterprise cultures can actually consume. That has been done as much for moving the needle on DevOps adoption as all the evangelism and all the stuff we do when we run DevOps Days events around the country.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that DevOps, to your point, it's kind of an evolutionary process. Nobody wants to be the first guy in, right? So you want to make sure that what you're doing isn't going to get you fired. For one thing, isn't going the company's not going to lose massive amounts of money by doing this. And so I think a lot of companies have been kind of reticent to implement DevOps and go down that transformational path because they're just it's the fear of the unknown. They're not quite sure whether they're going to get it right or what it's really going to mean for their organization. So when they do have those metrics behind them and those seeing the successes of other companies, I think it makes it easier for them to to say, okay, this is something that we need to do as a company to move forward. So what then do you think the industry's gotten wrong? I mean, if we talked about it a little bit, but what else has the industry gotten wrong?
Oh, I think to the point where the practices get lost in the journey, right? Like, we'll do this thing and you'll be doing the DevOps.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah.
No. It's when using the framework, using tools to communicate and tools to educate and start the journey. I think that's hugely powerful. I think when those get misused, and you get into the classic problems, Agile has a lot of the same problem as the companies want the ceremony and go through the motions, but they don't actually change anything.
Mm-hmm.
There's a tendency for people to do that around some of the common DevOps practices or disciplines where, or the ones that are associated with DevOps, well, I'm doing the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And great. What's the next thing? How does that
Yeah.
thing actually fit into what you're trying to accomplish?
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing the thing because the thing is fun or because it has a tie off to business value? And this is super important because, when so many times a lot of this stuff gets brought in, people are excited about a technique, maybe they're excited about a tool, and that's great, but they're thinking parochially just about sort of their department. It doesn't actually tear down the silos. It doesn't bridge the gaps to the next groups. It may make their process better in their little team and their little department, but the people downstream or upstream from them see absolutely no benefit from them. And what all you've done is created what we call a local optimization. And
Mm-hmm.
when the industry just feeds that, and you get sort of that local yay, it doesn't actually move the needle for the company, and you see, the company will see it as wasted investment or wasted time. It'll never take hold. The seed that you plant there will never germinate. And to the extent we encourage that as an industry, you know, I think that that's something that we get wrong a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Particularly dealing with an enterprise type customer where there's a much bigger process, right? Remember, delivering software is a business process first and foremost. The only reason we're writing software in an enterprise is because we have a business need, and that's when you get outside of that, or you only worry about part of that,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's difficult, and that's it's tough because a lot of DevOps starts down at the grassroots, and you have to plant those seeds and see if they grow anyway.
Right.
But I think the industry doesn't do enough of a job of helping the grassroots bubble it up and speak to power within their organizations.
Yeah, I agree, and I think two things that the industry's kind of gotten wrong about DevOps is one is the messaging that the tools vendors and other folks in the space have kind of focused on. To your point, implement this and you'll be doing DevOps, and it's been this mixed messaging for so long that I think at their initial phases, companies get confused. Companies that are looking at transforming their business through DevOps don't really get the clear picture of what it means to undergo a DevOps transformation. They incorrectly believe that because they buy the tools, or they have a particular type of process in place, that they're going to be seeing these huge benefits to the company, and we know that that's not the case. And along with that, I think what the industry's gotten wrong is not placing enough emphasis, an equal emphasis, on the process, the tools, and the cultural aspect as well. Because they all feed off another. They're all equally important, and if you put too much weight on one, more weight on one than the other, it's like a stool. It's going to be unbalanced and it's going to fall over, and you're not going to be able to sit on it. It's not a successful endeavor. So uh, what do you think? I mean, those are the two things that I think the industry's gotten wrong. But does that
It's
make sense to
it's
you?
No, it's super true. It's kind of like what I was saying is, you get that one and done tool vendor, you solve a point problem,
Right.
that can be a seed from which a grassroots movement grows. But
Hmm.
most of the time, you get kind of a one and done sort of a thing, and you don't have that message going out to the enterprise that this is a journey, right? There is no
Hmm.
such thing as, it's like having a product in the market, right? There's the
Right.
next version, there's next year's model, there's, it's a continuous improvement cycle. And that's why so much of the, like, we talk about lean and Toyota methodologies, and the continuous improvement Kaizen type things that you should be doing around
Hmm.
this in the broader system. And people don't like to talk about that because that's scary. right? That's
Right.
the transformational piece that we talk about. And like I say, it's paradigm. We call it culture. It's a paradigm.
Hmm.
People want to start, a middle, and an end. They want a project. I want to implement the DevOps,
Right.
right? Well, okay, bring in some of those practices, but then you've got to build the practice. You've got to build the culture. You've got to build the mindset for continuous improvement in your organization. And here's that thing about that continuous. We talk about a lot of continuous in DevOps.
Hmm.
Continuous, it doesn't end,
Right.
right? Right? There's going to be stuff that you're going to discover that needs work. There's going to be a new bottleneck. There's going to be a new problem. There's going to be a new group that doesn't want to get on board, or you're going to discover a new piece of technology that you're going to want to bring in, integrate, and improve your existing process. Which means you have to know your process. You have to understand where it all fits together, and you're going to be in a continuous state of adjustment and change. Well, if there's no stick a fork in it, it's done. How do I declare victory?
Right. Right. It's kind of like owning
Right?
a house, right? There's always something. So,
Oh yeah,
but it's
tell me about it.
yeah. So what are some of the challenges then that existed 10 years ago that we're still dealing with today? I mean obviously we've kind of gone over some of them, and I think we're seeing some movement in the industry as far as recognition that yeah, the messaging hasn't really been what it should be. And yes, companies are now realizing that it is that continuous process. But what else? I mean, is it corporate buy-in? Is it making that cultural shift? What do you see as kind of the biggest challenges that we still need to address?
I think that the one of the bigger problems, and this is actually something that the DevOps movement is just starting to really get into, is understanding how to measure this thing, how to
Mm,
measure once you've established some practices within your DevOps initiative or growth or journey. How do you measure that so that you know where to improve, right? I mean, one of the big things that I've heard for years on this is, okay, look, how do I know if I'm getting better, right? How do I prioritize that? Um, and that involves looking at different metrics than you're used to, and and shifting that view into a set of outcomes that you're not used to measuring, right? Uptime is interesting, but it may not be what you're interested in, what you should be measuring, what you're
right,
trying to do,
right.
right? I mean, that's where you start looking at some of your architectural challenges, but ultimately, what you're dealing with is a management cultures, especially within large IT organizations that tend toward the bureaucratic, right? They're kind of
Hmm.
handed a how-to manual in the form of ITIL back about 20 years ago now.
Oh
Thank you, British government,
boy.
right? And it's this little guideline. It's the easy button. You just sort of follow it. Well, they say do this and have a ticket for that and track this, and we're good to go. And DevOps says, well, maybe.
Yeah, maybe
Right? It
not.
sort of challenges a lot of
Yeah.
those things, right? Maybe that's the wrong thing to be measuring if you want to achieve a different business outcome,
Hmm.
right? I mean, those that was built in a time when IT was a shared service. It was uh, a mindset of a utility.
Right.
It's a captive utility inside the corporation. It's a cost center. It has
Hmm.
SLAs, and so on and so forth. And it created this sort of bureaucratic thing, but it was very easy to manage because it was well defined and it was clearly metriced. So you knew how to set it up. There was a kit, and a lot of companies don't have the organizational structure or wherewithal or engineering culture
Hmm.
to redefine, build those things for themselves. And there's not really a good roadmap for DevOps as a whole. There's stuff for specific practices, like we can certainly get continuous delivery. We can get you to continuous delivery on apps and families of apps. We have the technology for that. We have the understanding for that. We certainly know how to do that. And um, let's remember that the Jez Humble book is from 2011. It's still basically the definitive book on how to do it. So
Yeah.
there's a pretty good, and that's one of the reasons that when you talk about DevOps, continuous delivery is one of the biggest families of practices
Hmm.
that people can adopt and get started with on their DevOps journey. And 10 years ago, we still have this problem is to get to the bigger picture DevOps stuff. You have to change how you think about what you're doing it and redefine it and build yourself a new operational model.
Hmm.
Right. You're not going to be able to use the kit operational model anymore. You kind of have to look at what you're doing and build your own and redefine your own. And that's really hard for companies that,
Yeah.
they may not even have the skills in house to do it.
Yeah, and DevOps, there is no one size fits all solution. So, it really, really does depend on what your organization, what outcomes you guys are looking for. But I can, and I think that's also one of the reasons why it's so scary for companies because they don't have that kind of instruction manual on implementing and making that transition to DevOps. So I think I think as we have more success stories, more case studies, more examples of companies that have implemented DevOps and screwed it up and then gone back and done it again and came out with a better outcome. I think that kind of helps ease the minds of collective organizations to maybe DevOps is and realizing again that it is that journey. It's not just a one-shot deal. It's got to I would think that more companies are going to be more comfortable with making that transition. I want to take just a second here to remind the audience that if you have a question for Dan or me, please just use your control panel and submit your questions. We've gotten a couple in. Eugene asks, actually, what is the length of transition usually? And as you've said, Dan, that really depends, and it's not really a transition, or there's no end point. It's not a there's no hard stop when it comes to DevOps. So what do
Right,
you?
continuous improvement.
Yeah.
Yeah, continuous improvement. Right. I mean, the manufacturing industry, it goes back. It's like read the Phoenix Project, read the goal, I recommend them in that order, by the way. The and you see all these things, and thematically, it's like, okay, look, we figured this stuff out in certain areas, and applying it to IT is just a new application of some very old principles and concepts. And continuous
Hmm.
improvement, as the name implies, there's no end. It's not a one and done. And this is the thing that organizations deal with culturally. Is like, well, I got to go get funding for our DevOps implementation. Well, you don't implement DevOps.
Right.
First of all, right, you can implement some practices around it, but once you're done implementing a particular set of practices, that's great, but then you're on to the next ones, and you're fine tuning the ones you've brought on board, um,
Hmm.
and rolling the ones you brought on board out further into other teams, and constantly tuning and realigning those. And that implies that you have a particular perspective on how you're going to utilize the app systems that they support, right? So you've got a portfolio of thousands of apps because you're a big enterprise. Well, some of those apps
Hmm.
are going to be ones that you look at in a certain way and invest in a certain way, and others you're going to look at in a different way. And Gartner tries to put that into two buckets, but I think the spectrum is much more complicated than that.
Hmm.
But you have to pick those things, and you're never done, right? It is continuous improvement. Transition, don't know. You
Right.
can control to a certain extent the time that you start to see some tangible value and impacts in a
Uh-huh.
certain area if you sort of think it through. But yeah, there's no transition to
Right.
DevOps. You start where you are, and you head off in the DevOps direction and get philosophical.
Right. Right. That's a good way of putting it. Just get philosophical. So Eugene actually has a follow-up question, which is from your experience, what is the most difficult part of a DevOps transformation, and how would you resolve it? How would it be resolved?
Getting started,
Taking that first step?
getting past the analysis. Yeah, getting past the analysis paralysis at the start, and doing something, and that first step has to be something more tentative, more than a tentative monkeying about proof of concept on something, right? I mean, it has to be a committed directional first step. And to a certain extent, you want to put something pithy out there that there's nothing to it but to do it. But in a large organization with you know, quite a few people and the dynamics of having a group of people involved, legitimately you have to put out some clear reasons and a vision for what you're trying to accomplish, and
Hmm.
then align what this big first step is going to achieve.
Right.
And sometimes that can be very hard. That can be very hard if you're not at a certain level in the organization. But without that vision and direction, saying this is what DevOps means to us, this is where we need to go, and DevOps mindset and practices are going to get us there, you're just going to kind of dither.
Hmm.
And that's the biggest hardest thing right there, is that getting that stuff straight and then taking a big step towards it. Yeah, easier said than done.
Right, right, right. Okay. All right. Well, we've gotten a couple other questions in, which I want to get to, but I want to talk a little bit about kind of that people aspect of DevOps, because I think it's very important, and I think it's also one of those areas that people have kind of given short shrift to because they just don't think it's as important as making sure that they get the right tools and they implement the right processes. But at the end of the day, humans are stubborn animals. So if they, and I'll be the first to admit it, if I like the way I do something and somebody tells me I should do it some other way, I may not listen to them. And I think with DevOps, you kind of have to understand the reasons why certain things are happening, and you have to get that buy-in from everybody to really make that transformation and make DevOps that transformational process or journey. So, with that in mind, what do you think, first of all, do you think that kind of cultural or people aspect has gotten easier or more difficult with DevOps over the past 10 years?
I'll tell you that it's easier now because
Hmm.
people are aware of it. Which is a big chunk of the problem, right? And sort of first part of solving, first step is to admit you have a problem.
Right.
Um, right, as the saying goes. So from that standpoint, yeah, I think that piece of it has gotten easier. Um, what to do about it, I think, is still a very very difficult thing. I think that part hasn't necessarily gotten that much easier, other than there are more lessons out there for people to leverage. But
Hmm.
generally speaking, a lot of enterprises are still sort of classic command and control bureaucracy type mindsets, again, particularly around IT, but far more broadly than that, depending on the industry or the company or its age, and all the other vague factors. And so, people who are comfortable in those environments and in those cultures, then, asking them to be the one who sticks out, or
Hmm.
do that, they're taking a pretty substantial risk with how they identify themselves with their careers. If they really like being at that company, change is a risky thing, and leading change is asking them to really step out. And that's not a really that's not a trivial thing. And to the
Right.
extent that you can help them learn and educate and de-risk, I think that's where they mostly where you'll see people get the most traction and make the most progress. Um, so I think those kinds of issues are never easy. I think those are probably a human constant, right? I mean, if you talk, I've worked for a lot of startups, and one of the biggest challenges sometimes is if the company needs to pivot, is to
Hmm.
realign. It's like, okay, so we were going for this vision over here. Now we're going to go for this vision over here. And it's related, and there's a dotted line and whatnot. But sometimes even for what would be considered a very relatively small group of people, 40, 50, 60 people, all of a sudden that swing, it'll dislodge people even in that at that scale. So you have to be very careful how you set the vision. You
Hmm.
have to be very careful how you articulate that, and you have to be deliberate in shifting the culture. You can't just sort of say, "Oh, well, we're doing this now," like it's a command and control. Well,
Right,
I
right.
declare the culture this. That's not how it works.
Well, I think you also have to answer that question, that it's a fundamental question. It's why? Why are we doing it? And I think if you
What's in
can't
it for
offer a
me?
good reason, people are going to say, well, no, I'm just going to do what I continue to do, and it's worked this well so far. So um, I think that is the biggest cultural issue that DevOps is facing, is not enough companies are answering the question why. And I think once that question is answered, I think you're going to get a lot easier buy-in from all the stakeholders, you know, at all points of the organization. But it's kind of interesting because obviously, because there's no one size fits all solution for DevOps. People are different animals also. I mean, there's no one size fits all person. So do you think we're ever going to get to uh, the frictionless DevOps from a cultural perspective?
Well, I think if you put a group of people together, you're always going to have friction.
Right.
I mean, nothing here changes the fundamental nature of humanity, right? If you put enough
Right.
people together, there's going to be friction. Um, the but the truly, I think that this is one of those things where it's going to go in fits and starts. There's going to be periods of, even within just a single organization, right? There's going to be periods of rapid advancement, rapid progress, and real major and noticeable success, followed by periods where things are kind of middling along while we're learning and about the stuff that
Hmm.
we've done. We're maybe consuming and internalizing that success before we hit the next thing. And I think that when those swings happen, that's where you have this challenge between. That's where you really have to have leadership rather than management, right? I mean, you have to have, leaders are better at dealing with change. Managers
Hmm.
are better at maintaining a status
Managing
quo.
people. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And yeah, there's a balance to be had there. And when you are deliberately transforming, you can't manage your way to a DevOps culture. You have to
Hmm.
lead your way from where you are to that DevOps type culture, whatever that really means. But
Right.
I don't like putting DevOps as a label on things, per se. Um, but but to make that shift, as you're trying to begin or progress your DevOps journey wherever you are,
Hmm.
you need leadership type mentalities and behaviors, and management type behaviors. They're probably not going to get you there. Um, they're going because they tend towards a status quo. They tend to be more risk averse, and
Hmm.
those are very good things. Don't get me wrong, particularly if you're in a company that has to report numbers quarterly,
Right.
right? But
But
weighted against that is stagnation and getting punished for not having growth in those numbers.
hmm.
Yin and yang. So frictionless, no. I think that's I was never into the
Just,
kumbaya piece.
yeah.
But
Well, so yeah, I mean, it's kind of a way, it's a fact of life, right? You're always gonna, to your point, we're always gonna have, you get a bunch of people in a room, you're always gonna have friction. So, do you ever see a point where there will be enough of I don't quite know how to ask this question, but will we ever kind of reach a critical mass culturally when it comes to DevOps? I mean, obviously you're never going to have everybody on board, but what's that tipping point within an organization where maybe not everybody's on board, but enough people are to kind of move DevOps forward, moving that transformational journey, forward.
It's not a popular, it's not a cool way of expressing it, but I think it's
Hmm.
going to happen quietly. I think it's going to be one of those things that you keep pushing in that direction. One day you wake up and
Hmm.
then you kind of go, holy crap.
Yeah.
You get somebody who's been there for long enough, they'll look back and say, like, wow, it's the year 2030 or whatever, and looking back to how we used to do things, I can't believe uh, how bureaucratic we used to be, or
Hmm.
how slow we used to be, or that we didn't do small batch agile things. We were all waterfall SDLC from the 90s or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and it's going to be a moment of realization more than it is. There's not going to be a fanfare. Um,
A
it'll
ta-da
be every
moment.
Yeah, it's going to be one of those things where you just get down into it and you keep driving forward towards it, and pretty soon you realize, wow, look how far we've come.
Things have changed. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Great. So we've gotten a bunch more questions, and I want to go ahead and go through some of them. Scott asks, does the cloud better enable DevOps?
So, it's funny, because we had one of the prompt questions kind of along this line about technologies and stuff.
Right.
Cloud and the DevOps have come up together, right? I mean, if you look at back, I guess DevOps is 10, AWS I think is 12,
Mm.
right? I think officially, you know, but certainly it's about the same age, and they have come up and fed off of each other, and uh, to the effect that they've come up together, they've fed each other, right? So the cloud has taught the DevOps movement lessons. DevOps and the mindset and the thought going on there has pushed stuff back into cloud. Look at some of the services that Amazon or Azure and Google and all of them offer in their packages, in their service offerings. You look at those kinds of things that are in there, and those are clearly reactions to stuff that the DevOps movement has put out as concepts and ideas for how you can better manage something, or how you can better organize something, or how you can better architect something.
Mm.
Um, right, and those are that virtuous circle here has been much more symbiotic than people realize. And so, does cloud enable DevOps? Yes. But does DevOps drive the cloud forward? Yes. Because it changes the way people think about it. Look at the number of people who completely miss the point of virtualization, right? The number of enterprises
Hmm.
where you hear these stories about how it takes 4 weeks to get a VM,
Hmm.
right? It's like
Yeah.
literally exactly the same amount of time. We had a yeah, like I said, I'm one of the organizers for DevOps Days Austin. We actually had a speaker come down from an airline, and it was a great presentation. But one of the things he said was like, yeah, they completely missed the point on virtualization. It takes them
Hmm.
as long to provision a VM as it did a physical server.
Yeah. So
And
so why do it? Yeah.
the reason what? Well, no, because the justification for going virtual was server density. We could reduce our
Right.
data center footprint, reduce the cost, da da da, and it was purely a cost justification. They didn't look at that technology as something that shifted a paradigm. It's like, well,
Mm.
if the server is no longer physical, well, that means I can provision it. I can throw it away. I can,
Hmm.
it was back when you contrast that with the folks who were, at the time when virtualization hit big, about 10 years ago,
Hmm.
unsurprisingly,
Yeah.
or well, about 12
Mm.
years ago, right? Think about that one, right? There's a certain, the people when virtualization first hit big, the early adopters were like, well, wait, if these don't exist, it can change the way I fundamentally allocate capacity to my applications. I can change the way I do configuration management. And that's where all that early days DevOps stuff uh, came into being, and we started looking at, well, no, you treat your servers as livestock, not as pets, right? They're
Hmm.
disposable. You just recreate them, right? You'll push the button, you've got a fresh version of the same thing you just had. and then you adjust it from there and you go. And it can be all automatic and super easy. Take all that friction and bureaucracy out of it. And yet, contrasted against that is you have companies that didn't shift that culture, they didn't shift that mindset. They looked at it as purely an IT cost kind of a thing. And now and then that mindset shifted, and that's where containers have hit big for a couple of reasons, feeding off that same mindset.
So then if the cloud and DevOps are kind of a symbiotic, have kind of a symbiotic relationship, I guess the question is, would DevOps exist if it weren't for the cloud?
Yeah, because you would you'd have virtualization. I mean, containers are almost a 20-year-old technology, right? I mean,
Right.
Docker is 5, but if you want to go all the way back to BSD jails or whatever, right? I mean, that you can go back to pretty much the turn of the century on that stuff. So I think that even if it weren't for cloud and the ability to have microcharged outsourced capacity for your computers, there'd be something with the level of flexibility that we're looking for. Because the other thing that's going on here is not even so much about just cloud as a way to manage your infrastructure and the services you consume, but you're seeing the shift in architectural patterns towards increasingly modular applications. And in terms of long-term trends, that just makes sense. Like everything else, you look around at most manufactured goods, certain principles and piece parts and whatnot become very, very standardized. The more modular it is, the more maintainable it is.
Okay.
And as the software industry starts thinking in those terms, I think you'd have seen something, even if cloud and the business model for how we provide technology services and consume them, there'd be something else.
Okay. But do you think that DevOps would have been as successful without the cloud?
I think it would have been. So the short answer is yes, but I think that the success would look somewhat different, right? I mean, because to the extent that DevOps is associated with certain practices and architectures, as the most successful thing, the loosely coupled architectures, or if you're dealing with legacy stuff, the entanglement architectures and those kinds of things, that would be different. Would that be less successful? I don't know.
It'd just be a different.
I don't think it would look different.
Yeah. Okay.
But the shift more or less. I think the shift more or less had to happen one way or another.
Yeah. So what other technologies that or that are kind of DevOps in origins or really has been part of the DevOps transformation that you see as kind of impacting the IT industry as a whole beyond clouds? I mean, you talked about containers, but are there other technologies that kind of arose out of the DevOps people, processes, and tools, and that whole package?
It's been massive. Yeah.
I don't even know how to describe it, because you don't want to say I'm doing DevOps, because it's just part of it.
Yeah, no, we get a ton of different stuff, right? I mean, so if you think about what DevOps has done for the adoption and of like automation and how we systematize things and how we deal with those, and just frankly the willingness to bring automation in and just not tolerate the classic bureaucracy and runbook and handcrafted approach to things. DevOps as a flag for leading that effort has been massive, absolutely huge, right? You see similar things on the monitoring side. The amount of intelligence we've brought to how we bring logs together, how we bring the information together, how we look at those things and analyze them. Again, DevOps has been a major flag under which that discipline has advanced. You see, the streaming stuff as things have scaled up. The the uses of streaming type technologies for logs and for other things has become huge. We've seen security injected earlier and earlier and really shifting left, and a way to actually do that pragmatically with the developers, has been a big part of DevOps moving forward. Huge things, and just over the horizon, we see AI now being applied across all of these things. So these major technological disciplines that have seen a big leap forward, and DevOps is a key either enabler or leading, a big tent under which we can talk about these things and really reform them, has been a massive, massive help there. And now we see AI getting ready to be striped across all of these. And how do we, now that we understand the complexity that we're dealing with, how we're now engineering for this complexity and dynamism, how we're now worrying about or thinking about how we put ruggedness into the systems that we're building and make that a systematic part and dimension of what we're building. DevOps has been a massive, massive I won't say driver of that, but I will say it was a big tent under which a lot of these conversations could be brought forward, and solutions to how we bring ideas and solutions into these specific disciplines. Very important.
Yeah, definitely a conversation starter for a lot of these technologies. I think you're right, and I think especially in the realm of AI, I think that companies see that it's not kind of one of those weird science fiction type, we're never really going to get there. They're actually seeing practical applications for AI in DevOps. So I think it's kind of made a lot of technologies that previously might have been thought of as a little too far out there, a reality and something that's very tangible for their business model. Okay, great. So let's take another look at some of the audience questions. Suresh is asking, is DevOps for IT vis-a-vis Six Sigma for continuous business process and quality improvement? And can they both coexist in an enterprise?
So to the extent that DevOps to the extent that DevOps speaks to a lot of continuous improvement and sort of the same sort of mindsets that Six Sigma did or does, then sure, I think there's a great deal of synergy there. I think there's a level of discipline and stuff that goes with Six Sigma that DevOps may not be culturally as well aligned for. Can they both coexist? I think absolutely, right? I think that is a completely reasonable thing. And honestly, from my own experience working with different companies, the ones who have strong engineering cultures that maybe not in IT, but they actually do engineering stuff as part of their core business, they generally get it a lot faster because they've already got a paradigm to understand when you're talking about this kind of transformation, re-engineering a process to work better and be more measurable and get the information out so that you can do continuous improvement. They understand kind of what that means, right? They look at it a little bit differently than an IT person would necessarily, but they're IT people because they're tied off to these engineers. They get it. The paradigm is much better set than if you're in a business that has no internal engineering, for example, other than the guys in IT, and they don't have to worry about maybe the manufacturing side or the whatever type of engineering that they do, and that's it's an interesting dynamic for sure.
Okay. All right, great. I kind of want to keep moving forward here. So I've got another question from Jeff who. And this is actually a really interesting question. So when you start to move toward DevOps, what's the feasible goal for the first step?
What's the feasible goal for the first step? So
maybe
ultimately,
defining what the first step should be.
Well, yeah, through that, right? No, truly, right? I mean, one of the first goals might be to actually build a value stream that everybody can look at. Go get a thing on value stream mapping, look it up and do it for the app or system of apps that you're concerned with. Right? Go talk to the people upstream or downstream from you, depending on where you are in the organization. If you're low down in the organization, this is a great exercise for you to meet cross-discipline teams and actually interact with broader pieces of the organization to a good purpose. And the great part about that particular exercise is that that will tell you where the big bottlenecks are in that value stream, and then you can kind of pick and choose which ones are going to be achievable, good first successes that you can go for, right? I mean, you can kind of figure out what the low-hanging fruit is there. Do some work under the DevOps umbrella. Say, hey, we want to bring DevOps practices into our organization. Get some of those low-hanging fruit out. Get some quick wins, which give you some of the momentum going forward to elevate the conversation, get some victories, and get some good feeling around it, and maybe bring some people into the movement and into the effort to really get things up and running. That's why continuous delivery, for example, is a place where a lot of people start, because first thing you do is you figure out that end-to-end piece, then you start finding where can we re-engineer that, rejigger it, add some automation to really bring that, get some of those first initial wins and get that momentum so that we can spread the adoption, spread the word, and really get the momentum in the organization.
Yeah, and I think that's critical. If you can show a first win, then people are more apt to sign on and want to be a part of it. We are about 4 minutes to the top of the hour, so I want to kind of close out with one question here, which is, what do you think will be the biggest technologies, architectures, or operating models that we should expect to see in the DevOps space moving forward?
So we already talked a little bit about the operating model thing and the shift there, and I don't. That's a whole conversation unto itself. Technologically speaking, there's a question in the stream here about containers. I think modularity and microservices to the extent that they increase modularity are going to be a big thing. Does that mean containers or something beyond containers? Right? As we're already talking about serverless and some other things. That's an open question, but I will say that I firmly believe that technologies and stuff that lead us to more modular architectures and continue that progress towards modular, loosely coupled architecture where you can swap things in and out and actually have maintainable sized pieces for the application systems. I think those technologies are going to thrive going into the future, right? I mean, the monoliths are done.
What about open source versus closed source? I mean, that's kind of an argument that I've been hearing a lot about, whether whether open source is really going to kind of take over in the DevOps space, and whether it's worth it. And what are your thoughts on the kind of the open source argument?
I think it depends, right? I mean, you see, I think there are pieces of open source that are definitely going to go forward. Enterprises, though, those are the ones that are generally more commercial, like the pattern that Red Hat laid out, right? 20 years ago, it became a thing, right? Where, there's open source and there's a lot of great stuff that falls out from that, but you have to have somebody keeping it organized and doing the engineering to package it up. I mean, can you imagine if every enterprise out there built their own Linux, right? I mean, they could do it, right? I mean, literally, you could.
But why?
But why would you? So I think there's going to be a balance point there for where that stuff gets commercialized and where that stuff doesn't. I think you see a lot of open source out there that are random projects that people bring in. And you actually end up more of a situation where they're building where you get into a build versus buy discussion, right? It's like, well, we can download it and build a bunch of custom stuff around it, and make it our own, and that's awesome, right? I mean, I do stuff like that, but the problem with that is that there's a build versus buy thing that in business terms has to be looked at, right? There's a technical answer and there's a business answer. And they may be one way, they may be the other, but you have to look at it through a more complete lens. And I think, nerdily speaking, there's kind of one answer. As a business person trying to do the right thing for a very large scale organization, that answer may be different.
Hmm.
But if you're not thinking that through, and you make an emotional decision, that's where people get into trouble.
Yeah.
So I think open source is going to be a critical part of the DevOps movement going forward.
Hmm.
What the balance point and the sweet spot uh, is going to be variable, because I think commercial is going to be a big part of it when you start talking about enterprise-wide type issues. There's certain things that just can't go away.
Hmm.
But I think you're going to see a lot more Red Hat style stuff out there too.
Okay, great. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I can't believe the hour flew by so quickly. But Dan, thanks so much for your
Good
time.
catch.
This is a wonderful conversation we had. At least I enjoyed it. I hope the audience got a lot out of it too. But before we sign off, I do want to just remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of our conversation, you'll be receiving a link via email post-event that will take you to this webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website. So you can always go check the DevOps.com, just check under the webinar section. We have a bunch of webinars there that are upcoming and on demand. So hopefully there'll be one or two that also pique your interest. So Dan, again, thanks for your time. And thank you everybody who joined us today for this webinar. And I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks, Dan. Take care.
Thanks, Charlene. Great talking to you. Take care.